Okay, so this is going to be a short video, simplified version of the good towers to take in Legion TD 7.0 for the early game. So by early game, I mean mostly wave 1 through 7, but I guess wave 1 through 9 in general. And some of these obviously are subject to change if my views change through playing the game more and I discover more about the towers, but this is my current general idea of the towers. I am rank 1 currently, so hopefully some of this holds a little bit of merit. And let's get started. So, Adept. I think this is okay, but not amazing. See, Admiral. Actually, we'll skip the auras in general for this. Basically, you want to fit in auras when you can, but be careful because they can be a gold sink sometimes. So you have to make sure that the rest of your towers are strong enough or that they benefit enough from said aura. If you get a vamp aura, for instance, you better have good towers to benefit from that, such as a bunch of veterans or whatever it may be. The upgraded troll, B, and also the unupgraded troll, I think is worth mentioning, is also a B. They are both pretty similar in value for their cost. Wandagu, A tier tank. Knight is let's see, Knight is also going to be a B tier tank. I'll get the job done, it's decent. Crusader is more of a D tier tank. You'd prefer not to grab it, but it can do what you need it to do in those early stages of the game. Or in fact, it's actually more like C tier. Obviously, late game it's much worse, but early game like C tier. Phoenix, trash tier. Elite Archer, A tier. The AoE is pretty good. It's decent damage. Just got buffed as well. Azure Drake is B tier. It's a little bit worse than the other dragons. The other dragons I will put at A tier. They're definitely very strong. However, you do have to be a little careful that you don't make too many of them, and you still need some other tanks and piercing damage as the game goes on. Bigfoot, D tier, pretty bad. Assault tank, trash tier. Dark Mage, A tier, pretty amazing, but situational. You need something worthwhile for Dark Mage. That is generally going to be dragons or something like Destroyer, which is actually S tier for me. It's 400 gold, like almost half the cost of a Bone Dragon, but it can basically do similar to what a Bone Dragon does, so that is extreme value. It does fall off at 10 onwards, but for the early stages, S tier. Ascendant, D tier. It is a really good debuff for later, but you don't actually want this upgrade in the early stages of the game. Clockwork is pretty good. I actually rate it A tier. Defiler, B tier. Solid, but not as good as Fangtooth in the early game. However, it does get stronger than Fangtooth as the game goes on. The Blood Raider will be a B tier, along with some of the other summon heroes, such as the Harbinger, which is here. And let's see. I think bottom feeder is kind of like C tier. Its damage is pretty weak, which is its drawback. Gyrocopter. Actually, let's skip the aura. Like I said, let's try to skip the auras when I can. The Gyrocopter, pretty decent still, even though it's an aura, because it is piercing, so it'd be somewhere around A. Forsaken one is like A tier. Fire Archer should be around like C tier, but that's subject to change. It did just get recently changed, so unsure of his exact position. The Knoll shall also be C tier. Doppelganger is B tier early on. It does drop an effectiveness later, but early on it's alright. It does have evasion, which does have quite a bit of value overall though. Goliath is like C tier. You definitely do not want Goliath before wave 6, but it can be pretty strong on 6. And that's why it's only C tier in the early stages, because of how weak it is before wave 6. Like that's half the waves where it's pretty weak. The Flesh Golem will also be in C tier. Warlock is not too great. I'll put it at C, but I don't really know if that's the right spot. Maybe it should be even at D. Heroes, you generally want to avoid heroes this early into the game, but sometimes they can carry or just do what you need them to do at that stage of the game. So I will have them at a C tier. Obviously you want one later on, but at this stage of the game it's pretty questionable. Goblin Blaster is a C tier. It's pretty questionable. Ghost, I will put it B tier, but Ghost is really interesting. As the game goes on, it gets exponentially stronger and becomes like the strongest tower in the game. But in the early stages, it's really costly. So as much as I want to put it at like an A tier, I think I can only put it at like a B tier. Because for someone not used to Ghost, they will put it in their lineup and they'll be like, yo, this is complete trash. But if you have the right lineup for it, it can still be B tier even in the early game. Witch Doctor, no, we can skip that. Frenzy Ghoul, D tier, pretty trash. Greymane, like C tier, B tier, I guess. It's better than these tanks, I guess, but it does need support. Brilliant, B tier. Guard, A tier, possibly even S tier, honestly. I've been using it more lately and it seemed pretty good. Especially on some of the most difficult rounds being Wave 4 and Wave 7. Hades and Lord of Death, I shall put in S tier, mostly because of the economic advantage you can get out of them. You can get your wood economy very high. Rogoth, trash tier. Leviathan shall be B tier, I think, but it's questionable. It's possible it's more like C tier, actually. I'm not sure. Some of these can be interchangeable on different rounds or in different situations based on what your other towers are. Druid of the Talon, which is, I don't actually remember its name in the game. Like C tier. It has Chain Lightning. It's okay-ish. Nothing too special. The Ghosts, Hellraiser and Hellghost are like B tier. They are pretty solid on some of the rounds, but sometimes they walk too far forward and die too quickly because they have short range. And they also don't benefit from aura towers. Apart from like maybe the mana regen tower, I guess. High Priest is like a D tier. Mostly because if you are going to be making a priest, then it should be the actual priest, which is, in my opinion, an A tier tower. But you got to be careful to not make too many priests, but a couple of them is pretty good. Basically, the heal does not scale well enough for the cost early game. The only benefit of this is to not take up too much space, but that doesn't matter in the early game because you don't actually have too much space taken up because you don't have many towers yet. Dwarven Engineer should be around C tier. Its splash is surprisingly decent for the first few waves for its cost being pretty cheap. So I think it's okay. Maverick, S tier. It's so amazing on so many of the rounds. You can do a lot of damage, but you definitely need some tanks to follow it up. The slow towers, the Magnetar, the Polar Bear, and the Tree of Time are all A tier. They are some of the strongest towers on many of the rounds, but they're pretty weak on round 1 through 4, which is why they're only A tier and not like S tier. Okay, and then we got Harpies and Medusa, which, where's the Medusa? I would put them both at B tier. They're pretty good. You gotta be careful, make sure your rest of your composition is good, but otherwise they're decent. Meat Wagons, pretty similar to Dwarven Engineer, so like C tier. Whereas their upgrade, the War Machine, is actually pretty bad. It's like D tier. I think the upgrade is not really worth it. However, it does get better at wave 10 onwards. So later on, you might want them. But before wave 10, it's better just to have a couple of the unupgraded versions, I believe. Highborn is S tier. This tower is amazing. It gives you frost armor, heal aura. Its cloud does damage as well. It has piercing damage. You do have to kind of use command attack on it sometimes if it's not, you know, working properly, like walking back and forth. But otherwise, it's pretty good and just makes your front line a lot tankier, especially with frost armor. Okay, Hydra. Hydra is somewhere around C tier. It's very strong on some rounds, like round 4. It can carry round 4 pretty much by itself. Just add in whatever you have and it carries round 4. But it is pretty bad before round 4, and it's not exactly great on some of the rounds after, so it's only like a C tier to me. Machine robots. Machine robots are like B tier. They're okay, but they did just get their cost. They just got their cost raised a bit, so yeah. King Claw. Unlike Bottom Feeder, I do rate King Claw a little bit higher at B tier, but you got to make sure you upgrade it on the right waves. So Bottom Feeder is fine on 1 through 3, and then King Claw on 4 and onwards, because they do change armor types from heavy to medium. Or I guess King Claw from like 5 onwards. Maybe Bottom Feeder on 4 is fine. Mercurial, I rate somewhere around A or B. I'm going to put in an A, but maybe like a B actually. So the thing is, it did get its cost just raised a bit, and its unupgraded version, the Wraith version, is really costly. I'll put it like a C, and then the upgrade is pretty worthwhile in comparison at a B. But this version is really costly now. And Militia is around a C, possibly B, especially on certain rounds with its medium armor. The Mermaid is like an A, I think. I think the Frost armor itself is pretty good for 130 gold. But you generally want to get Highborn when you can. Militia is interesting. See, the thing with Militia, it's really strong, and you do want some for like wave 10 and stuff. But it is single target, and it doesn't really become that strong until the later stages of the game because of its single target. But I will still put it as a B. Oceanus, also a B. It's pretty powerful on some waves, but also a little sketchy on certain other waves, so you got to be careful of the timing of it and what the rest of your tower composition is. Mistress is an A, very valuable debuffer with mischance on everything. Messiah is very situational, so I'll put it at a C, but it does have piercing damage, so it's definitely not the worst. Griffin is A, it's similar to the dragons and can be very good on like around wave 4 onwards. The Tree of Travel, a little bit worse than the slow aura ones, but it is okay on like round 4, and then you eventually upgrade Tree of Time on either round 5, 6, or 7. Butcher, A, top tier tank. Even though it just got nerfed, it still has frost armor and its disease cloud, so it's still very strong. The Revenant is like a D, just doesn't have much merit to it. So you can generally do better than a Revenant. Trident, also like a D. It oftentimes just doesn't do what you need it to do. Thunderbirds, S tier. These things are amazing, especially if you can get them in large numbers. You do have to be a little careful on some rounds, particularly medium armor rounds, as these do have magic damage, but with enough splash they can still crush those rounds as well. Soul of Villain, same as like the Warlock in C tier. They're okay, and you do want them in the long run. A Night Saber, like D tier. I've tried to use it and it just always seems kind of bad now. I thought it might be good now because they got buffed, but it still seems bad. Meridian, I think is trash tier. You do want it. You do want like 1 eventually, but it's not actually good in the early stages. Oracle is an A. if you just get 6 things with an Oracle buff early, it gives you a lot of value. And its heal is okay as well. The Pandaren is like D tier. It's kind of sketchy. There's a couple ways where it's okay, but generally it's pretty bad. Spiders are probably like C tier. You would prefer other piercing damage if possible. Zeus is A tier for sure. It's, you know, Zeus gets stronger as the game goes on. But even in the early stages, it's still pretty good at like A tier. So we shall put it A tier. The Phantom, unlike the other upgraded Ghost versions, I think this one's only like a C. And I think it's relevant to point out. Necrolite, in my opinion, is trash tier. Maybe it's actually like D. Like maybe it's worth as much as like a Night Saber or something, but it seemed pretty bad for its cost, and you generally prefer to keep the Necromancer as a Necromancer so that you can upgrade it to Ghost later. Ogre, similar to like Trident in this B tier, you know, an okay tank that you will be happy with if you don't have any other tanks to use. Sword Mage, I think, is highly underused, but is also kind of situational for the type of pseudo tank single target damage it provides. It can be pretty good on rounds like round 4, for instance. So consider that. I would put it like B tier because it is pretty powerful, but it is situational as well. Tuskars should be A tier. They were changed, but I still think they're pretty good at A tier. You got to be a little careful on some rounds because they won't they won't exactly carry you on like round 3, for instance, but they can be pretty powerful moving past that. The Explodey tree, the tree of knowledge, is A tier. However, its effectiveness does continue to drop as the game goes on, and you would rather have Tree of Life as the game goes on, but Tree of Life may be more like B tier at the early stages of the game. And the unupgraded Yggdrasil version is probably also around maybe C tier, like one stage below. But sometimes you can't afford to get the upgraded versions because they're just so expensive. At least not the Tree of Life version. Sometimes you can usually afford this one just because you know it will do damage for you, and that's what you need sometimes in those early stages. Okay. Violet. Violet is somewhere around C to B tier. I think it's B tier, but it's not a late game tower, and sometimes it gets itself killed because it has short range, so you have to be very careful with it. Okay, so Tree of Battle is pretty much trash tier. You generally want the other upgrades instead. Veterans, A tier. As far as cheap tanks go, this one is one of the best for its stats. Warden is somewhere around B tier. She does need some support usually, like maybe a priest or, you know, other tanks as well. But if you can get her online and actually afford her, she can do some good things sometimes. Sky Dragon, I don't really play with that tower, but I think it's okay. The withdraw ability it has some relevance. It's like C tier. What else is there? We got Wolverine. Wolverine, should it be B or? I think Wolverine's like a B tier. It's pretty powerful on some stages. and benefits a lot if you have things like Priest Heal or some passive healing from Highborn and Frost Armor and stuff. That can give it a lot of value, but it is a little bit weak on some waves like wave 4, so you got to be careful with this, but it can definitely carry you pretty well on wave 3 for instance, so B tier. Pyro, the version before Destroyer, is kind of mediocre for its cost, but maybe still like C tier, probably similar to like an Adept with it, because it does have chaos damage too. Soul of Hero is like a B tier. You don't really want to change its stance, but so you just leave it as it is, but it is pretty decent for its cost. 160 gold for like 2200 health. B tier type tower. Okay. Skeletor. Skeletor is somewhere between C and B. And I think I will put it at a C tier. You generally don't want it, but it can do what you need it to do. These Farseers, A tier. They can be S tier if you get them like wave 1 or 2 and you know how to use them properly, but they're a little risky because they do have some weaknesses on certain waves. You got to be a bit careful with them. However, if you can potentially snowball with them if you have them like wave 1 and you build properly. So we'll give them like A tier. The Tauren, unlike Bigfoot, is actually just trash tier, and Bigfoot's not much better, so try to stay away from those. Let's see, what else is left? The tanks. Tanks are pretty much trash tier. Steamrollers, trash tier. They're all pretty bad early game. They're really expensive and just don't offer much at all. The Wind Rider is more like a B tier tower though. The poison effect can carry you on wave 1 through 4 sometimes, as long as you have enough other stuff in front to where the Wyvern can, or the Wind Rider can get its poison effect on everything. And anything left besides Aura Towers and so on? It's somewhat worth mentioning this tower, the Sea Giant, is also decent actually as a tank. I think it's actually like a B tier because it has a bit of AoE, it has normal damage, it has okay health pool. But sometimes you want to upgrade to the Hydra for 4 and use the Sea Giant on wave 1 through 3 for instance. The Riders, which is the upgraded Colts, the Hippo Riders, is kind of like C tier, I think. They are not that great early on because they are single target, which is, you know, obviously just not too great in the early stages of the game. And you can ignore these. Is that pretty much it? Maybe worth mentioning Half-Breed. I think Half-Breed also does as well as Goliath early on. Like they both be kind of C tier. But Goliath obviously gets a lot better as the game goes later, from like wave 6 onwards. Maybe Half-Breed's more like D tier, to be honest. I don't know. Maybe not even worth putting up there. Let's see. Thrall, trash tier. Orc War Chief, which is the unupgraded Thrall. I would actually put it at D, but honestly, you generally want to stay away from it. Because in the early game, it just doesn't offer you much. Mutants, unlike Dwarven Engineers at C, I think mutants are actually trash tier in the early stages. But maybe that's just me. I don't know. And yeah, this is the same as this whole thing. Anything else I'm missing here? Or is that it? I think that's pretty much it as far as what's worth mentioning for this shortened version. Yeah. Some of the auras, generally overall, auras are going to eventually be S and A tier. Apart from maybe Vamp Aura might only be like B tier or something in the long run. But they can have merit even in the early stages. Somewhere anywhere from like C tier up to A tier in the early stages. So feel free to mix them in when you can. But be careful not to make too many of them because, well, too many Aura towers just don't hold very well in the early stages. And yeah, that's my tier list for the early waves of Legion TD, primarily wave 1 through 7, or 1 through 9, I guess. And some of these do change drastically as the game goes on. Ascendants, for instance, starting from wave 10 or even wave 9, suddenly jump up to like A and S tier type tower for like the rest of the game. So keep an eye out for that. But generally, this is what you would look for the early stages in order to hold up to getting to wave 10.